The movement has put another turbulent week behind, with more of its people incarcerated and accusations of police brutality from the released Oakland protesters. However, the focus of the protests fell on anti-war movements and the need for people all over the world to live side by side in peace. So the lineup this week is a review of issues, demos, and actions against war. War is a Lie retraces the journey of the movement for peace to highlight the case against war. Give Peace a Chance is our report on the week's anti-war demos and actions, while World Peace Please attempts to present the real reasons for Washington's threats of war against Iran. And
hi, this is David Swanson recording for Occupy Wall Street Week. I am
the Saying It No Frills interview to shed more light on issues that motivate the 99 percenters.
It is said that war is human nature. Thus, it has always been, and thus it will always be. Peace is, of course, human nature too, and there have been anti-war factions for as long as there have been wars. The roots of Western anti-war movements can be traced to the 1930s, when it was first noted on a wide scale that corporate interests benefit most from war, that young and poor people bear the burdens of conflict, and that those with the most to lose in war have the least say in deciding to engage in it. Organization of opposition to war has occurred in waves ever since. War is a lie, unnecessary and criminal, asserts longtime peace activist and author David Swanson, and there is never a good outcome which can justify the deaths of millions of innocents. This argument can be applied convincingly to both world wars and every major conflict since, but there is no greater lie than the war on terror, perpetrated by Western corporate interests for over a decade and serving no cause other than enriching a small ruling elite at the expense of the rest of us. February 15, 2003, a coordinated day of protests across the world against a looming war on Iraq. Leaders of Western countries ignored the mass turnout of 8 to 30 million and unleashed massive destruction on Iraq anyway, based on outright lies promoted by relentless propaganda from mainstream media. Shock and awe did not just lay waste to Iraq, it also disabled the anti-war movement, removing the illusion that leaders paid attention to their constituents. Activists began to regroup as the wars on Iraq and Afghanistan dragged on. But it didn't take much to cause them to stand down again. All it took was the election of a president tagged with a preemptive peace prize. War actions, both covert and not, continue and have finally reached the point, in conjunction with increased drumbeats against Iran and repressive actions against Occupy Wall Street, where the anti-war movement must gain momentum. Occupy has experienced first-hand U.S. government threats and repression. It is not a coincidence that legislation aimed at Iran and the Occupy movement was signed into law on New Year's Eve. It is an important step for peace activists to join with Occupy now and stand as one against endless war and its effects on all humanity.
Well, I think part of the explanation is how it started. As many people are aware, a group of us had long planned to start on October 6th, the 10-year anniversary of the invasion of Afghanistan, an occupation of Freedom Plaza in Washington, D.C. And in the days leading up, Occupy Wall Street in New York became major news in the U.S. corporate media, thanks to police brutality, thanks to stupid decisions by Mayor Bloomberg, and corporate media choices. And encampments rose up around the country, and they originated not in Washington but in New York City, with an understanding that the primary target was Wall Street, was the bankers, and the war profiteers, despite being such a huge portion of the 1%, were thought of as something different, if thought of at all, as part of the government. And the government has been depicted in Occupy Wall Street views as puppets, whereas the puppet masters are the real targets of our international solidarity and resistance, and they are on Wall Street. And I don't think that's false. I think it's incomplete. I think a major section of the 1% is the war profiteers. and that unless we take on both the bankers and the war profiteers, we are doomed. There were progressive populist movements building in the United States. Nobody remembers when September 11th happened, and they were all shut down by war propaganda. That happens more often than we like to think. The propaganda of war, of patriotism, it is within us more than we like to think. The partisanship that makes wars an acceptable target when the president is a Republican, but not when the president is a Democrat, is a factor as well. And I think there is overall a general failure that's not unique to Occupy Wall Street to take on the military-industrial complex. It is the #1 opponent of just about every good cause, if only in financial trade-off. It takes over half of federal discretionary spending, leaving little for schools, for environmental protection, for infrastructure, for everything worthwhile, leaving the United States so far behind in health and education and life expectancy and so forth than other countries without as much money. And it's not just the bankers, it's that we choose to have more aircraft carriers and missiles and bombs and billionaires. And a huge mechanism through which we funnel money from 99% of us to that 1% is through the ever-growing military-industrial complex. And we are up against the corporate media's propaganda. As the corporate media played a role in allowing us to create Occupy Wall Street, it has turned against it, ignored it, slandered it, libeled it, supported abuse against it, and at the same time pushed the usual propaganda that is moving us closer to wars in Syria, in Iran, and expanding the military-industrial complex while falsely reporting that it is being cut.
And I don't think any close studier of the relationship would believe that Israel would launch an attack without the full support of the United States. And that's what we're trying to stop by demonstrations beginning today.
Hands off Iran. National Day of Action was announced with short notice by a coalition of over 60 peace and civil rights groups and prominent citizens. Protests were held on February 4th in more than 80 cities, primarily across the U.S. and Canada, with a rallying call of no war, no sanctions, no intervention, no assassinations. Saturday has come and gone, and thousands of protesters rallied in march against another war on another sovereign nation. A rally of about 1,000 protesters at Times Square in New York City included mic check speeches and a march to the U.S. and Israeli UN missions.
We have a very fancy stage.
Individuals from OWS NYC were present, but no major show of solidarity from Occupy was evident. A major rally also took place in Boston, with speeches by Iranian and Jewish Americans.
These wars just don't happen. That they happen because we have a system of militarism and corporate greed that makes these wars inevitable.
Israel every week is saying we need to bomb Iran, if not this week, next week, if not this month, next month. And the US says, why is Iran being so belligerent? And yet every week Israel is saying we're going to bomb you. And US drones are flying over Iran. And when Iran shoots them down, Iran is a terrorist for shooting down an American drone on top of their country.
The Boston event staged a march to the Israeli consulate, with Students for Justice in Palestine in the forefront. A small rally was held outside of Central Command at MacDill AFB, Tampa, Florida. Protesters from various anti-war groups marched and spoke out against sanctions and covert war actions against Iran, as well as the overt threat of war. Police intervened as protesters marched on CENTCOM, advising action must take place in a free speech zone. This attempt to curl those marching was rejected. Rallies also took place outside the White House in Washington, D.C. Occupy D.C. was not present at the rally because National Park Service police chose to evict the McPherson Square camp earlier in the day. In fact, A cameraman for this program, one of the DC occupiers, could not tape the event because he was arrested. There is some disconnect between some members of OWS and established peace activists, and bridges are still being built. However, it is evident that Occupy, which stands against social and economic inequality, high unemployment, greed, as well as corruption and undue corporate influence on government, must at some point come to terms with the fact that spending trillions of dollars on endless wars is the #1 reason for most of the problems faced by the 99%.
There is no question that we ought to be speaking to the nation of Iran, which is open to speaking, open to dialogue, open to negotiation, open to exporting uranium for refinement. The nation of Iran, which has not attacked another nation in centuries since it's had that name, which has been repeatedly attacked and assaulted, and its government overthrown by our own in the 1950s, assaulted with our assistance by Iraq in the 1980s. Iran is a nation that we could speak to, that is participating in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, unlike Israel, and complying with it according to all available evidence, unlike the United States of America. There is going to be escalation and war if there is not diplomacy. There's not some middle ground where you depict Iran as evil, you lump it in now with China and Russia as the new axis of evil, you refuse to speak to Iran, you treat as treasonous anyone who would take that approach, and yet you attempt to avoid war. This is a middle ground that disappears under your feet. It cannot be done. It also will not be possible for the United States to persuade Iran or the world that an Israeli strike is independent. While the United States government gives Israel billions of dollars, over $1 billion in weapons a year, installs military equipment and troops in Israel, works hand in glove with Israel's secret intelligence agency, and continues to veto any measure of accountability for Israeli crimes at the United Nations. It's absolutely not credible that the United States is attempting to rein in Israeli aggression in a serious way. That has to begin. There has to be an open dialogue about a nuclear-free Middle East, not just a nuclear-free Iran. And we have to stop edging toward escalation and sanctions with false accusations, threats, and sanctions against ultimately the people of Iran. This is a disastrous course. It's one we've been on before, all too recently. It's an incredibly close parallel to Iraq, where we're now being told that Iran is a threat to us, that Iran is developing weapons, as Iraq was, that Iran has missiles that can reach the United States, as Iran was to do with unmanned aerial vehicles, which we don't hear that much about these days, having become drone nation. There is no question that if there is war, there will be patriotic fervor on both sides, and there will be a defunding and a demobilization of all things good and just within the United States as well as outside of it. So you cannot have other priorities while remaining indifferent to the question of whether or not we go to war, including whether or not we go to war without large U.S. casualties as an immediate result. I mean, this is the problem. It's not just that a Democrat moves into the White House. It's also that the U.S. military casualties have been declining. That is a huge factor in U.S. peace mobilization, and it should not be. We are killing human beings. We are killing human beings with drones. And this is not without blowback. It is not without suicides by drone pilots, but it is ultimately a question of whether or not we are going to care about the 95% of humanity that is not part of the United States citizenship.
Iran's first democratically elected premier, Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, was ousted in a CIA MI6 orchestrated coup in 1953. The Western-backed monarch, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, returned from self-imposed exile and placed Dr. Mossadegh on trial on treason charges. Mossadegh's only crime had been to nationalize Iran's abundant oil reserves and reduce Britain's whopping 97% stake in Iran's oil that had been imposed on the country in an infamous 1907 so-called agreement. Prior to the 1953 coup, Britain, an empire still at the time, brought its massive battleships into the Persian Gulf, and they trained their heavy guns on Iran's oil installations. Mossadegh was vilified, although he'd offered a healthy 25% stake to British Petroleum's forerunner, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. But the profit margin was just considered not big enough by the 1%, so Dr. Mossadegh's government was brought down in Operation Ajax. Many historians agree that the seeds of mistrust and rejection of the West were sown at that moment in Iran. Later, the US statesman offered the Shah nuclear power to replace Iran's oil as a source of energy. The culprits, including the young Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, did so to justify the rape of Iran's oil and gas. Under a program called Atoms for Peace, Iran was given a test reactor by Washington and allowed to build the Bushehr nuclear power station. In 1993, Iran's abundant oil was found to be heading for depletion, with reserves estimated to last only decades. Energy security issues forced Iran to seek nuclear energy as an alternative future source of energy. Iran, despite its position as a signatory to the NPT and a member of the IAEA's Board of Governors, was refused fuel rods to power its plants. It began to enrich uranium to 3.5% for fuel rods and 20% for the American-built test reactor in Tehran, used to make cancer medicines. Tehran is accused of building an atom bomb, despite numerous reports exonerating the country. The US aircraft carriers have been sailing into the Persian Gulf and training their weapons on Iran. The movement can help stop the 1% cycle of threats and intimidation of other nations now, or it can let the 1%ers proceed to kill millions more of the human family.
There is a core of dedicated peace activists and peace organizations that will never, ever go anywhere, that will not be fooled by propaganda, will not be dissuaded by police crackdowns and media censorship. The question is how large we can expand a movement for peace and justice and for economic conversion, for moving away from dumping all of our money into the military and putting those resources where they would do some good, both in the United States and abroad. And there will inevitably be bursts of peace activism given the right conditions, both partisan conditions and conditions in terms of U.S. death counts and the size of and the duration of military adventures. And of course, as we move toward so-called surgical strikes and unmanned wars, it becomes, and unannounced wars and unauthorized as well as undeclared wars, it becomes less and less likely that we will see mass mobilizations without a new understanding and a newly energized organizing. And the hope for that is indeed in the Occupy movement. If the Occupy movement brings together all of the movements for social justice, for environmental justice, for civil liberties, for a redirection of our resources into a machine that can take on the military-industrial complex as well as the Wall Street industrial complex, then we will have a chance to build something that will last and grow and overcome even new bursts of war propaganda. I'm pushing for more. I'm pushing for a deeper thinking through of what we are up against and greater mobilization against the threat of war. At the same time, I'm more hopeful about it than I've been in many, many years, precisely because of the Occupy movement on the ground. It's not just the occupation in Washington, D.C. and Freedom Plaza that has taken on the military-industrial complex. It's Occupy encampments all around the country that to one degree or another have made that a big part of their agenda. That needs to be expanded, but at least it is there. At least it is growing. And if it doesn't sit on its hands, if we don't do nothing for the next several months because there's an election coming, if instead we remain independent and push the entire government in exactly the direction we want and leave the compromising to our misrepresentatives in Washington, we will improve both the election and the governance that follows it. So keep on keeping on.